welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. According to the latest digital reports, there are more than 4.3 billion internet users around the world. That means that more than half of the world has access to all the information the internet holds. Couple that with all the mainstream media channels, newspapers, and magazines. It's no secret that we live in the age of information overload. But the question is, with us being constantly bombarded with information, are we more informed or are we more confused and anxious? We welcome our panel to explore this issue today. We have joining us in the studios today Professor Samina Yasmeen, who's a sociologist. We're also joined by Mr. Paul Bernal, who's an analyst joining us from the UK. Thank you both for joining us. Now, Professor Samina, let me begin with you. With all this bombardment of information in the age that we're living in which our phones are connected to the internet 24/7, we are exposed to a variety of views, competing views. How do you think that's changed our relationship with information and how we engage with it?
I think what I'd answer with is by going back to the 1990s, when there was a conference in Beijing, and I still remember one of my colleagues telling me that she could go on the internet and get all the speeches that were being delivered within a half an hour or so. And I was so impressed because that meant for the first time I didn't have to go to libraries and I could get that information. Now we've come to the point where as the speeches are being delivered, for example, at the United Nations or in other international fora, that becomes available. As people are doing something, they also put that information. As things are published, they come out. So even as you know, the media, it not only just comes on TV channels, but it also has digital presence. What it does is that it includes so much information that you rightly pointed out, it creates an information overload. It does not equate with knowledge and wisdom because we've got data, but we don't have the time to actually process that data, because it's coming on our entry at such a fast pace that it's humanly impossible.
Right. And with that, Mr. Paul Bernal, while we're talking about the fact that we're getting information, but it might not resonate with us in the same way that it did before, how do you think social media is playing a role in that confusion and that disillusionment?
Well, there are three sides to it. The first side is that increasingly we're using social media as our route to information. So it matters a great deal how social media does it. The second thing is that we have this illusion that what we're getting from social media is somehow the truth, that it's one particular, whereas it's actually one controlled perspective that is automatically generated, automatically curated by algorithms that are not neutral or fair or whatever. And the third point, and I think this is the most important, there are people who are deliberately working to misinform us rather than to inform us. And they're working specifically to use the way that social media curates our news to actually create something that is deliberately false rather than something that is either slightly misleading or confusing, but deliberately false.
Right. And let's get to that point in just a bit, where we talk about the forces behind social media and all this manipulation. But before that, I'd like to touch upon the point in which you mentioned algorithms at play and how we see news appear on our news feeds and our timelines. How is that news specifically designed in a way so that it exposes us to one side of the story as opposed to a more holistic overview?
Well, almost all of our sources of information on the internet, whether it's through Google search or through our timelines on Twitter or our Facebook newsfeed, there is so much information that they have to curate it, to select which bits to show us and which bits have most priority. They select it based on the profiling that they've done of our previous stuff. So they choose things that they think we will be interested in, and they think we'll be interested in them based on our past record and what else they know about us. But those algorithms do that automatically. It's not somebody thinking, oh, this person might be interested in this. It's all done automatically. And where you have an algorithm that does this automatically, there will be other people who will work out, well, how does that algorithm work? how can we get our news pushed to the top so that people will see it? And we call that gaming. They game the algorithm to try to find their way to make their information get to the top of our lists.
Right. And with that gaming going on, Professor Samina, and all mechanisms in which information comes at the top and how algorithms are working to show us information that we would like to see. That really goes to the age-old concept of confirmation bias in a sort of a way, that we are seeking the information that will prove our preconceived notions. How do you think that's amplified in today's age?
So when I answer your question, I really bring my knowledge into how the news that comes to the top of our news feed shapes our views. So if we're looking at, for example, a particular point of view, and we keep looking at those news, then the news that we get actually keeps on feeding into that. What it does is that it creates polarization. It creates echo chambers, as some people argue, and it creates a situation when people are convinced of the argument that they already have. So it's very different from real scientific investigation. Because, again, speaking as an academic, but even any other a normal person, we have hypotheses. And our responsibility really is to say that we need to make sure that they're proven wrong. But with the news feed coming like this, what it ends up doing is that it actually validates our hypothesis without us doing anything. So we collect all the data to say we are right.
But Professor Samina, just digging deeper into what you said, that as social scientists or academics, we are supposed to prove or find ways in which our hypotheses can be proven wrong. But we do know that no knowledge is objective. And when a person even chooses a hypothesis, it's because of certain factors at play. So as we are, as the natural instinct we have as humans, isn't that there all along, whether we're using social media or we're using more traditional forms of seeking knowledge?
Yeah, but I think with social media and so much digital information, the quality and the quantity of that validation information is so great that our mind actually switches off to alternative points of view. And another thing that I point out is that, especially in the age of Twitter, because we go with little sound bites, few words that must communicate certain information, what we end up with is a lot of data and this tendency to divide that into bits. So I think that Twitter bits actually create a condition in which we cannot really analyze data properly. Right. And because we can't analyze it properly, we tend to give it significance, which may be out of sync with the reality. Or what we do is, as you said, our already existing biases magnify whatever we have, and we become very sort of authentically convinced of what we are trying to say.
Right.
So the capacity to actually question what we have is gradually going down.
Right. Mr. Paul, following from that and our discussion with algorithms, I just want to point out a couple of examples and ask you why algorithms for such platforms is working differently than others. Now we have Spotify that exposes us often to music we probably would like or would probably be new to us. It would expose us to a different kind of taste. But when we have algorithms in Twitter and on Facebook, as both you and Professor Samina have pointed out, it exposes us to information that we would like to be exposed towards. Do you think this usage of a different algorithm for Facebook and Twitter is deliberate, or do you think that's just how they have evolved into being?
Well, I think I should start with those two things may sound as if they're different. They may seem different, but actually they're working in the same way. Because the point is not that it's new to you, but it's that it fits in with the pattern of what people like you have been listening to. So Spotify will choose music that they know that other people who listen to the same kind of music as you do listen to. It may seem like it's new to you, but actually it fits in the same pattern. And the same is true of news. So if you are interested in a particular subject, then they will find new stuff on that same subject with those same biases that's new to you and that but that fits in with your existing pattern. But I think there's another point here. I mean, confirmation bias is one point, but it's the ability of others to use that confirmation bias to feed into you that makes a big difference. And related to that, it's the way we do our conversations on social media, in particular the way we do our arguments on social media, that drive what we look for. We don't look for the truth. We look for something that will help us to win the argument that we're having on Twitter. So somebody says, that's not true. You quickly search for something that says, yes, it is true. You don't check whether your thing is true or not. You've just got something to help you win your argument, which is your main desire. It's not about a search for truth anymore.
Right.
It's about winning arguments, validating positions, and so on.
Right. And Mr. Paul, with that, I'd like to add that that is also something that I've personally noticed social media doing, that it creates an equivalence of sorts between facts and opinions and makes all opinions equal with the same weightage, even though the sources and the investigation that has gone through the production of that information might be significantly different and variant. But following from the point that you mentioned earlier, that there are actual motives at play to create certain opinions. Let's talk a little more about that. Now, social media has a very fleeting nature. How do those people who want to manipulate knowledge create a narrative that sticks?
I mean, I think that also brings on to a main thing, and that is actually the role of the traditional media in this social media environment. Because what the social media needs, what the people manipulating social media needs, they need something to hook onto. They need something to link to use as their starting point. And often those starting points come from narratives spread by the traditional media. So suppose you've got a very biased TV station like Fox News in the US, for example. They start a story, then the manipulators hook onto that and find a whole load of stuff that they can then use that existing source as a way to start it. So the traditional media is part of the same picture. Social media uses stories created, narratives created on the traditional media, and then take them further, take them to a more extreme area, and twist them a little bit towards their own means. So it's all part of one much bigger picture. And that shows actually what the potential beginnings of an answer to this can be. And that's actually with the traditional media focusing much more on accuracy and precision and much more careful checking of information and so on. Once you get a more responsible traditional media, you have less to hook onto. The trouble is, right now, they're seeking attention, the traditional media. So to try to compete with the sensationalism of the social media, they go more sensational themselves.
Right.
And that makes everything worse again.
Right. And Professor Samina, engaging with that point that it's traditional media that is also exploiting this wave of creating sensational news. Do you think that this is unique to this time, this modern age, or do you think that has always been the case?
I think I agree with what Paul is saying, that in fact, if we look back into the past, there were media outlets that were very committed to good quality investigative journalism. And they would give information that would add to our knowledge. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have Watergate scandal coming out into the open. But now what we see is that it's not just simply proliferation of news outlets with people becoming the agents. It's also linking that to advertisement money.
Right.
So because the traditional news media also relies on money for the advertisement, when they see that it's actually moving into the direction where any information, whether it's true or not, actually gets validated, they also get into this race. Because if they don't, and if they're only just giving you solid information, what do they run the risk of? Being ignored.
Right. And also, we're talking a lot about polarization and the creation of opinions. And who do you think exactly benefits from that here? The increase in polarization and divide that's being systematically created, from what I understand, you're also alluding towards, and something that Paul is also alluding towards. But who is benefiting from that?
Look, it depends on who is using that for a particular purpose. If we look at political campaigns, what's coming out is that a lot of politicians either consciously or unconsciously become part of this scene where they create an image, they create a story which gets picked up by other people. So it serves them politically. They get more votes, they get elected, especially in democratic governments. In authoritarian governments, then it benefits those who want to create a particular narrative. So they can do that. But there's also a problem, which is not benefit, I think it's a disadvantage or a loss to humanity, is when people come up with these ideas and they promote that because they have a certain vested interest in that. And it's purely cultural, it's purely political. If we think about, for example, Islamophobia, and if we go back, say, 20 years ago, information about Muslims multiplying at a very fast rate was a common sort of email being shared among different people. Now it comes onto the internet and it gets promoted, and people use it to promote right-wing white supremacists.
Right. And Paul, following from the questions that I just asked Professor Samina regarding who really benefits from this polarization, another question that comes to my mind is that wouldn't it in fact benefit political parties if there are people who aren't completely polarized but are still lurking in between? That would perhaps get them votes or get them political mileage from people who aren't just dedicated voters, aren't just loyal, don't have just blind loyalty to their parties, but they'll get them a greater and a more new voter base.
Well, it might do, but at the moment that's a minor factor for them, because their main concern is to find those people who actually will go out and vote. When you have relatively low voter turnout, if you can have a small section who will consistently vote, you're better off focusing on them. And in practice, that's what's happened in the UK in particular. And people like the success of Nigel Farage, for example, is not based on mass appeal. It's based on a minority but very committed minority who will go out and vote when they absolutely have to. But I think there's another factor here that's sometimes missed, and this is borne out in the empirical evidence, and that is that another group who benefit from all this are actually the social media companies. The Facebook benefits more when people share more information, and the evidence shows that the more extreme information is shared more often, the more sensationalist information is shared more often, the more emotional information is shared more often. So there's an incentive for Facebook to encourage people to have this kind of stuff on, because it creates more shares, more clicks, more advertising revenue. And so they actually benefit from the disinformation and the fake news and so on, which means their commitment to fighting against it is half-hearted at best.
Right. And that's a very interesting point to make there. Professor Samina wants to jump into this conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Because I think Paul is talking about UK, where you're not forced to go and vote in the elections. In Australia, where I live, it's compulsory voting for everyone who has to go. And what I've noticed in our very recent elections, that before that, there's a businessman, Clive Palmer, who decided that even though a lot of media was suggesting that the Labour would win the elections, he spent $60 million in a campaign on digital media, trying to break the vote in favor of the Labour Party. So in a way, the benefit for him, if you look at the results, wasn't really there for him because he didn't get any seats. But the long-term benefit for him is that the situation in Australia didn't change to the point that he thought would be unfavorable to him. So Liberals won and the Labour lost. So I think we need to think about benefit, not immediate benefit, but also how people look at it and not just simply get votes, but how also they deny other parties the votes in the process by using curated information for a certain purpose.
Right. And do you think our media, mainstream media, as well as digital media that is, of course, an offshoot of mainstream media, do you think it can ever be objective if we don't take political funding out of the picture?
I think media can be objective, even with political funding, and I'm going to go out on a limb for that. It does not necessarily mean that you would just take one opinion. I think where the media starts missing out the whole problem is when the media personnel also themselves become victims of this overload. So they have a job, and I'm sure you'd share with that too. You have to produce at a certain time period, and what you do is quickly get the information and make up a story out of that. If you're trying to see information that can be quickly presented, digital media with already traditional media presents you with that quick information. And again, as an academic, what I've noticed is that even the students' capacity to analyze data more rigorously goes down. Because it's there, it doesn't get thought through, but it gives you some sense of confidence and you present it to the people. So I hope that sort of answers your question, but I think it confuses the whole space in which we could look at the relationship between information, analysis, prescription, and wisdom. So prescription based on wisdom, which I think in today's age is seriously lacking.
Right. And Mr. Paul, talking about political funding and the motives behind it, we're also seeing government bodies and political leaders taking notice of the radicalism that is happening, especially online. The Christchurch call is just one example of it. They want to attack this in a very rigorous manner to counter that radicalism that is fostering on social media. Do you think these social media companies, even though they were very half-hearted in trying to counter these narratives, they will be pressurized into doing so now?
They'll certainly be pressurized into doing something. The question is whether that thing that they're pressurized into is going to have any effect. And when I say that the social media companies are half-hearted, the politicians are also half-hearted because they're very happy to accept misinformation that supports their political perspective and very unhappy about misinformation that doesn't support their perspective. And we've seen in the UK, we're currently having a campaign to see who's going to replace Theresa May as Prime Minister. And it has been full of misinformation directly by the people who are proposing to become our new Prime Minister. So every morning there's something new that is straightforwardly untrue being put forward by a politician. So I think we can hope for some degree of regulation that may work, but we'd be unwise in thinking that they will do something that will really work in a big way, because they would still like to take advantage of a system that allows them to persuade people to vote for them. And that, in the end, is what this is.
Right. And hold on to that thought. We're also joined by Amantha Perera, who's a journalist joining us from Colombia. Thank you so much, Mr. Perera, for joining us. We're talking about how traditionally, and even in this new age, traditional media is the source that even those working on social media go towards. Now, in this information overload, how are journalists vetting their information and making sure that it is accurate?
Well, I think one thing that we need to look at is that how journalism has come to rely on the digital network for information. And it now has become the primary source of information for most journalists. And the issue here is that even though gaining information on the digital networks is easy and quicker, verification becomes a bit of an issue because anybody, anywhere, can pretend to be somebody else there and put out information. So I think one of the key issues to look at right now is whether journalists who are gaining information from the digital network have the know-how and the awareness to detect fake news and absolute lies before they use them in their reportage.
Right.
And in most cases, most journalists don't have that.
Right. And Mr. Perera, you're saying that journalists themselves are turning to social media. That creates a problem there. It's making the problem very circular. Journalists are getting their information from social media. Social media people are getting their information from journalists. Are you saying here that journalists have stopped going and investigating into the field, actually extracting information from the root and bringing it out to the public?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that not that they have completely stopped doing that. There were a lot of journalists who were doing that, who were going to the source, who were trying to get information. The traditional boots on the ground type of journalism and knocking on doors, talking to sources. But what we see is a trend, an over-reliance by journalists to gain information from digital networks without verification and without looking into the authenticity. Now, that is where the problem lies. Journalists will go and get the information, do the hard work, and their stories will appear. But also journalists who do not do that kind of hard work, who just skim information from the internet or other networks and just put it out there. So both these kind of information.
And Mr. Perera, sorry to interrupt here, but I do want to ask, where does the editorial policy come into play? Because that's the fallback here, that if journalists aren't vetting information properly, there will be a mechanism to check them and put them in place and make sure that they verify their information. Would you say that that's also diminishing the power of editorial policy?
Yeah, I think we're going back to the issue of whether we can invest enough resources in terms of financial, human, and technological to make sure that journalism is up to the quality that you and I are discussing. And unfortunately, the answer right now appears to be no, we can't. So if we can't have enough hands at managerial level or gatekeeper level who can look at the information that is being brought by the journalist or brought by the reporters and check, okay, whether it's true, whether it's authenticated, there is a problem there. And also whether you can, if you don't have the resources to establish checks and balances, again, you have a problem. So we go back to this issue of scale. We need to put information out, but we do not have the resources, financial, human, as well as technological, to make sure those resources are authenticated and verified. And on top of that, we are also confronted with this huge opening up of space where information and lies and fake news and everything is just moving back and forth in the same manner and in the same sphere. So it's kind of like a devil's choice that we have here.
Right. And we were talking earlier about the business model at play here, and and how even traditional media forms, of course, rely on advertisements. So does social media. Do you think there needs to be an overhaul of this business model in order to produce information that is more reliable?
Well, I think much more than an overhaul, I think we need to look at a business model where you can make money out of giving quality journalism and keep doing that for an extended period. We've seen various projects come up globally, nationally, and regionally, and they survive for a fair bit of time, and then again they face financial issues. So I think right now, in this age of engagement, and age of engagement with everything that is at an extreme, we need to figure out how do we provide valid journalistic works and then make sure that people are willing to pay money for the production of such work. If you look at the digital sphere, the money that is being earned is actually not earned by the producer. The content producers are not earning the money. The big money is actually being earned by the platforms that are putting out all these things that have been produced, be it Facebook, be it YouTube, be it Google. It takes other people to produce and then puts it out to the network. So I think the model here is that how do we break out of that? And how do we start making money out of quality works of journalism?
Right. And do you think we're any closer to a solution?
Unfortunately, I don't think we are at a solution that is workable right now. people are trying various things. People are trying to figure out, if you look at what the New York Times has done and how it has achieved a certain level of independence, a certain level of being able to provide quality journalism, and also make sure that its digital operations are becoming viable. And Washington Post is also doing similar. But those are the rare successes. But if you look at globally, and if you also look at regionally, you say in places like India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, is there a model? Right now, there is no such model that I can talk about.
Right.
If I talk about my native country, Sri Lanka, what is the most attractive right now are the gossip sites. Unfortunately, that's the truth.
Right. And on that point, thank you so much, Mr. Amantha, for joining us and taking the time to talk to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion with our panel here. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion here, Professor Samina, we've been talking a lot about the solutions to end all this information overload. Is there anything that you see that is actually realistic and that can be adopted in the near future?
I don't think we can get rid of the model that's already emerged, which is that the more presence you have on the social media and support and followers, somehow you get more money from the businesses. And that's really where everyone starts moving into. I think where the solution, at least in my point of view, resides is re-inculcating a sense of critical thinking and analysis.
And how do you do that?
Good. I think we can't do it straight away. That's the first problem. Because we're really in a global, noisy place where everyone is talking. We're all sharing our ideas. And they're not valid, but we're all talking at the same time. And when people are listening to those ideas, they actually do not know how to discern between just noise and the real information. I think the universities or educational institutions in all countries have got a very strong role to play in that. Unless we tell our kids from a very young age to say, when you get an information on the media, on social media, it is not final absolute truth. You need to look at it, alternative sources, and you need to think about it. I think we're setting them up to grow up to think that if they go to a particular source, whatever they get, that would be the final truth. One thing that I often use for my students is to say, ask their opinion and then force them to look at totally alternative opinion.
Right. And on that point, Mr. Paul, we're talking about echo chambers digitally and those that are produced through algorithms, but we also witness Twitter users especially constructing and reiterating views that match their own. Now, as Professor Samina talked about, forcing them to look at the other side, do you think there can be any mechanism introduced into the social media space to create something that is similar to what she's saying, forcing people to look at the other side?
I think it's going to be quite difficult. There is a concept we talk about called exposure diversity, which is intended to expose people to diverse sources automatically. The trouble is that to do that automatically, you're also feeding into another set of algorithms that can be then gamed and manipulated to other people's advantage. But I would say there is a point of hope here. And, well, it's kind of hope and a little bit sad for people of my age. The evidence seems to suggest that young people are actually better at determining whether something is true or false than old people. Now, people in their 50s, such as me, actually are amongst the most likely to fall for fake news. And partly that's because they don't believe that they are susceptible, so they're kind of a little bit blasé. They assume they're okay, whereas the younger people are actually a little bit more cynical about it. And what's sometimes referred to as digital natives are better at navigating the information environment than the older people.
Right.
Now, what I think that means is we need to support them in doing that, and we need to be a little bit more humble as older people, not saying we know and you don't, because actually we don't know either.
Right, definitely. And on that point of younger people being more cynical, that does pose another problem when you can't trust any information at all.
For sure, it certainly does, and in some ways it's better, because it's better to be more cynical about everything than be easily fooled by the one thing that you think you can trust. But it does mean they need to learn how and when not to be cynical, when they can find something to trust, and how therefore to find something that they can really they can anchor on as a way forward. And that I agree with your other guest. I think it's one of the tasks of our universities. We need to be teaching students better how to find it. But it's also a task for journalism. In order to have something trustworthy, you've got to have it produced by the good media for you to be able to say, yes, this is a good place to go. This place does its fact checking. This place is less biased than that place. But you've got to have the good stuff there to start with.
Right, but then media is also facing a conundrum where they're trying to balance, well, not balance, but it's very obvious that every media house has its own political bias, and that's a bias they think is right to promote. Let's look at the United States. There's Fox News, and then there's CNN, and they will vehemently oppose each other and produce information just on one side. Who do you rely on in this case?
And that's the essence of the problem. There isn't anyone to rely on. And that's why the more cynical attitude, knowing that everything's got a bias and learning how to recognize something's biased is part of the key. And as I say, that's where universities and similar institutions should be working to help people to say everything is biased, find the bias, use your knowledge of the bias to seek out what is actually the underlying information, and find that for yourself through the biased information you have to start with.
Right. And Professor Samina, while we're talking about all of this does make me think about academia as well. And when universities are teaching students to find the bias and go to information to the source, we know academia can also be biased. Where is the source they should go to?
Well, I think academia needs to be more unbiased, because the way I look at academia and its role around the world is that we are the people who have to adhere to the principle of fairness and justice in terms of information that we get and the information that we pass on to the next generations. So it is our responsibility, first of all, even as creators of information, because academics produce papers, reports, ideas that then get taken up by others. We need to be very careful that exactly what you were talking about, that we don't rely on one source of information. We don't go to CNN and say, or BBC and say, that's the source of all reality. We try and see what is the reality elsewhere and then make considered judgments. Secondly, I think it's our responsibility to then communicate the same attitude to our students and our colleagues as well. Where the problem comes in is, and that's talking again as an academic, that now we're living in an age where the numbers count a lot. So if you produce a lot, publications, and again, you can produce that by using digital information very quickly, then you get sort of tagged as a much better academic.
Right.
So that creates a bias.
Right, and also the process of being peer-reviewed. That also seems to be what are the problems there? Is that the way to go, looking towards peer-reviewed journals, or is there a problem in that
I
standard
think peer reviewing is essential, because in a way what we're really doing is bringing in the knowledge and wisdom of others without knowing what they say about our work, but they judge us independently. But I think where you might have come across news is that there's some academics who did this exercise. They actually sent papers to peer-reviewed journals, papers that were totally nonsensical, but they were put together in a way that they seemed really authentic, and they got published. So I think academia has a responsibility to say, we need to learn how to look at information, share it with others, and communicate it in a way that actually makes considered judgments. That's what we have to also extend to our own students. That has to be also in the publishing space. But then it also requires change on the part of the governments that start assessing performance based on publication numbers.
Right. And Professor Paul, last question to you, and I do want to purposely create a sense of alarmism here. If we don't take a fight up against disinformation and misinformation, what do you think will be the political outcome in the near future?
Well, I think we're seeing it in the UK at the moment. We have a political campaign going on right now that is based almost entirely on false information. We are going to decide our leader based on entirely false information, and that is not a good situation for anyone. If we don't do something soon, that will become the norm.
Right. And thank you for that last note there. Thank you so much to both guests for joining me, Professor Samina, Yasmeen, and Mr. Paul Bernal, for coming and talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.